Welcome to Brewed in America. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. This is the podcast that gives you a little bit of levity in your week, possibly, but also gives you some really, hopefully, powerful insight on the foundations of our country and give you a little bit of context as to where we came from, why we're still here. This is Brewed in America. We look forward every week to looking at a different city or a different person, or maybe even a different founding document, a different car company, a different chocolate company, whatever the case may be, that is based right here in the United States, and kind of give us a sense of home and a sense of pride in our country. But as always, we must first go to the drip of the day. Today's drip comes from Plymouth, Massachusetts. So in talking about, we've got a exciting series that we're in the middle of right now. Plymouth, of course, is America's home place. It is America's grandma's house, if you will. And so today's coffee comes from Speedwell Coffee Roasters in Plymouth, Massachusetts. They're what we refer to as a small batch roaster, so they don't do a ton of roasting like Folgers or other big companies. They're a local kind of a mom and pop shop. But Speedwell Coffee Roasters in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The one I'm drinking on today is called Ethiopia Bombay Abore. So super American sounding, but is what they call a beautiful grade 1 washed Sadama. So that sounds great already. It checks all the boxes that you'd expect from these heirloom coffees. Of course, referring to Sadama. Of course, Sadama. Sounds a little bit kind of Al-Qaeda-ish to me, but it is a all-American coffee. So I'm not even gonna attempt to make light of that. But this coffee is a light body with a complex stone fruit sweetness and with a pleasing floral finish. That's according to their website at speedwellcoffee.com. My nuts and bolts review of it is it tastes like peaches and it tastes like jasmine. And that is nothing to shirk at and nothing to turn your back on. Those two things. I'm from the South, born and raised in the South. I've been here my whole life. My parents have been here their whole lives, and grandparents have been here, great-grandparents have been here, great-great-grandparents have been here their whole lives. So, and really almost in the same county in Florida. We've been here my entire life, and my genealogy has been here for a long time. And I can tell you, speaking from experience as a Southerner, peaches will do something for you. And if your coffee tastes like peaches, that is an exciting thing to get excited about. Oh man, that's good. That is great. Check them out. Speedwellcoffee.com from Plymouth, Massachusetts. You will not be disappointed. All right, so as I alluded to just a few minutes ago, last week, just to kind of recap, we touched on kind of the Puritan mindset and where the Puritans got a lot of their ideas that birthed America, not just the Puritans, but the Separatists and the Pilgrims, and kind of gave us somewhat of a 30,000 foot view of where the origins lie. And we kind of made it up to the point where we were talking about the Mayflower Compact. And if you didn't have a chance to listen to last week's episode, I can't encourage you enough. Please go back and take a listen to that. It's a relatively short episode compared to some of our others, but it is a worthwhile episode. It's going to be kind of our summary or our preface to the next several podcasts for about the next month leading up to July 4th. As I mentioned last week, the summertime in America seems to be the time when things happen, when things change, and to sort of pay homage to that and kind of make our own holiday out of this, we're going to spend the next month or so leading up to July 4th, Independence Day, where we go over why Independence Day even happened, why it's important, and why it changed history forever, and who's responsible for it. And who's responsible for it is Christians. And that is We make no bones about that on this podcast, and we will provide you hardcore evidence for that. A lot of the material that we are presenting on the podcast in the next several weeks comes from a book by Mark David Hall called Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, How Christianity Has Advanced Freedom and Equality for All Americans. Please go on Amazon and find this book for yourself and purchase it at $16 plus shipping. Shipping wasn't bad. I think total was $18, but please do your own homework. Don't take anything I say for this podcast on any episode, not just this one. But please don't take anything I say for granted, and do your own homework and actually check what I say. And I'll be the first to admit and every episode I make mistakes, and I'll go back and listen to the episodes and kick myself for missteps and things that I said that were not entirely not accurate, or maybe I misstepped and just said the wrong year or something. I meant like 1896 and accidentally said 1996. So there are mistakes, and I fully admit that. So please don't take everything I say at face value and for granted on this podcast. Please do your own homework. I do the best I can to make sure that everything is accurate and precise, and I ask that you do the same on your end to make sure that everything I say is accurate and precise. And if I'm wrong, let me know. Go on Facebook, email me. I think my email is attached on Spotify and iHeartRadio and all those sort of things, Apple Podcasts. But, please take some time to correspond with me if you find something that you don't feel is accurate. But getting over to the Mayflower Compact, as we were discussing and kind of briefly touched on last week. So the Mayflower Compact, the Pilgrims get to Plymouth Rock from Holland, and the first thing they do when they get off of the Mayflower is they establish a set of principles, it's a covenant that they made with God, that the government they are going to establish in the New World was going to be God ordained. And God ordained, I would encourage you to go look at Romans chapter 13 to see what the qualifications of God ordained government are. Oftentimes, Romans 13 is, I believe, taken out of context to say that that all government, no matter how evil or good, is ordained of God, and that is absolutely not true. Romans chapter 13, I believe, makes that clear that there are qualifications to being a God ordained government. And so the Pilgrims recognize that, and they set out to put the Mayflower Compact into action. And the Mayflower Compact can be boiled down into three doctrines, and this comes from these doctrines were not at this point in time were not unique to the Mayflower Compact. These were things that had been discussed and preached from pulpits all across Europe leading up to the Mayflower Compact. And so the book that I've been reading actually lays these out pretty well, and actually references a gentleman by the name of Henry Wolcott, who took some notes listening to a sermon in 1638 around an election, and that sermon was given by one of Connecticut's early founders by the name of Thomas Hooker. And these three doctrines, I will say the fourth is a doctrine. It's more of just a summary of the previous three, but these three doctrines are really and truthfully, they are all through our founding documents, whether that's the Declaration of Independence, whether that's the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, or even the Federalist Papers and the Bill of Rights. You'll see these three doctrines, they are pervasive through our founding documents and through the documents that currently run our country. And we'll also talk a few minutes today about how these three are being violated, and the violation of those three has led to some real issues in our country that we're seeing as we speak. So doctrine number one, the choice of public magistrates, or what we'll call officers or elected officials, the choice of public magistrates belongs unto the people by God's own allowance. So what this means, if you look over at 1 Samuel chapter 8, there's a story that we've talked about before on this podcast, at least on a few episodes, where the Hebrews, the Israelites, they were asking Samuel to give them a king like all the other nations. They wanted to establish a monarchy, a one-man rule government. And the Bible says the thing displeased Samuel, and so Samuel takes it to the Lord, and God says, look, Samuel, you know, obviously what they're asking for is not good. It's a wicked and evil thing. But I need you to just listen to them. It says, hearken unto the people, hear them out, listen to what they have to say, and then God later gives them what they ask for. And so that upholds and proves this doctrine here that the choice of public magistrates belongs unto the people by God's own allowance. God gives people the authority to establish government by the means that they see fit. Now, they are also, you have the right to suffer the consequences if you put in place a bad government or a government that does not conform to God's structure of government. So please don't understand what I'm not saying. What I'm saying here is, the people have a right to establish their government, but they also have an enormous responsibility here also to make sure that the government that they establish is the government that God wants. And you see later on in 1 Samuel chapter 12, where the people did it anyway. The Israelites put up a monarchy anyway, and they regretted it. Just 3 chapters later, they were in a world of hurt and went so far as to ask Samuel to pray on their behalf and ask for God's forgiveness for their wickedness and evil of even asking a king, as it says in 1 Samuel chapter 12. So, doctrine number 1, the choice of public magistrates belongs unto the people by God's own allowance. Doctrine number 2, the privilege of election, which belongs to the people, therefore must not be exercised according to their humors, but according to the blessed will and law of God. So, just to kind of help you with some of the vernacular of the day here, the privilege of election, meaning the vote, which belongs to the people, therefore must not be exercised according to their humors, or basically off of a whim. In other words, the people do have a right to put government in place that they believe is the best government for themselves within God's boundaries. But coupled with that, you now have the right to vote. If you are putting in government and yourself, you need to make sure that your election process, and that you as an individual, I don't mean election process as in like election integrity laws and things like that, although that can lend to that. I'm specifically dealing here with the individual. You as an individual, meaning you listening to this podcast as an individual, have a God-given duty and responsibility to not only vote, but to make sure that you are super clear on who you're voting for and making sure that you are making the right decision that God would have you, that you believe that God would have you make. And so, you know, that goes from dog catcher all the way up to the president of the United States. You need to be doing your homework and making sure that who you're voting for is not, you know, whether they have an R or a D beside their name should not matter to you. What should matter is if that person falls in line with God's will and making sure that they are doing what God wants them to do. So, for example, if they, just because they have an R beside their name, if they're in favor of abortion, or if they're in favor of, you know, the taking of innocent life without due process, which, you know, abortion is exactly that. They're innocent. They cannot speak for themselves. They cannot face their accuser. And so, you know, that is purely innocent life. And so to remove that, even if somebody is a Republican or somebody's a Democrat, that should not matter. If they are willing to, just as an example on the whole idea of abortion, if they are not willing to protect your right to life, they certainly are not going to protect your pocketbook. And your pocketbook, I think we can all agree, is far less important than an innocent life. But so, the second doctrine here of kind of goes along with the first, in that the public has a choice in establishing that government, but with that choice that God has given you, with that privilege that God has given you, that comes with an enormous responsibility to make sure that you are doing your part and making sure that you are doing your homework. And duty and responsibility are big words here. That means that is God's will for you to do it. It is something that one must do. It is not something that one ought to do. You must do it. The duty and a responsibility is something, you have a duty and responsibility to make sure that your kids are fed. Is that a choice? Is that just a recommendation? No, you must do it. It must be done. And voting and making sure that who you are voting for is the right person is no different. It is, I cannot overstate the impact of that responsibility. And what we're seeing right now, is, with government, and the United States government in particular, is that doctrine number 2 has been grossly overlooked and forgotten, particularly among the people of the United States in general. We're getting a lot of people that are voting that, they're either pulling the lever for a Democrat or Republican just because they're a Democrat or a Republican. And that's not going to cut it. That's not going to cut it. And that's really the past 100 years, possibly, let's be more generous to us, let's say the last 50 years, that is truthfully what's been happening, and it's gotten us into a real problem. The third doctrine here, they who have the power to appoint officers and magistrates, meaning the people, it is in their power also to set the bounds and limitations of power and place unto which they call them. So the third doctrine here is you have a right as a people to establish your own government. Then you have a responsibility to make sure that the people you are putting in place are godly, God-ordained people. Romans 13, God-ordained people. But the third doctrine is once you get those people in place, because you are the person that gives that power, the consent of the governed, you are the governed in this case, you give consent to those who govern, and being that you are the one that gives them consent, you are the sole person to set up the limitations and bounds in which that government operates. And so, whenever the government comes to knocking on your door and says, "Hey, we're going to tax you a little bit more, or whatever else," and I'm speaking broadly here, not as an individual, but whenever the government starts getting out over their skis and starts just doing things on a whim that are dangerous to your God-given rights, they have way overstepped their bounds. Government has a responsibility to stay within the bounds and limitations set by we the people. And that is laid out in the Mayflower Compact as one of the doctrines that are laid out in the Mayflower Compact and that exists in the Mayflower Compact. And so, that principle might sound familiar. If you've ever, gone through a class in college or in high school and have, done any study on the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, more than likely you'll have heard that referred to as a Charter of Negative Liberties. And what that means is it is a document that tells government what it cannot do. It cannot abridge the freedom of the press or the freedom of speech. It cannot establish a national government, a national religion. It cannot quarter troops in your house in peacetime without permission. It cannot go through your papers without a warrant, or through your possessions without a warrant. So the U.S. Constitution is a charter of negative liberties. Well, where did that great idea come from? It came from the Puritans. It came from all those that came before, all the way before 1620. This goes all the way back to, I think it said 1638. These doctrines were, really, put on paper as, carved into stone, if you will, that they were, finally laid out in words. But these doctrines, of course, existed before 1638. And this is just the place where they were summarized the best. But these doctrines carried all the way forward to 1789 when the Constitution was ratified. And the people who did the ratifying and the people that wrote the Declaration of Independence, meaning Thomas Jefferson and then the editorial committee, all these doctrines and precepts and principles were not new ideas to them. These were not things that they just had a great idea and put pen to paper and said, "Hey, this will work great." This is stuff that was preached from American pulpits for hundreds of years before the American Revolution. Now, that absolutely does not take credit away from the founders. Absolutely does not. They were incredible men, incredibly smart and well-educated men. Never saw the inside of a public schoolhouse, but they were incredibly well-educated, incredibly smart, incredibly well-read. And something that I believe all of us should be. I think, I would encourage everyone on this podcast to read often and a lot. I know I've made it a personal goal of mine to read at least an hour a day. And that is outside of my time of reading in the Bible. And I'm not tooting my own horn here. I'm just telling you as something I try to do. It doesn't happen every day, unfortunately, but it's something I try to do and something I encourage you to do. And I promise you, you will notice the effects in your life. And that's spiritual effects, of course, but also mental effects, and your mental acuity and your mental sharpness will increase by leaps and bounds. The more you read and the more you exercise that muscle, it has a huge impact on you. And so the founders, of course, they didn't really have a choice. They didn't have TV or radio back then. And so all they did was read. And as a result, we had extremely intelligent and smart and well put together founding fathers who knew the laws and precepts and principles that the Puritans had been teaching for hundreds of years prior. And, they because of these things we just talked about, because these doctrines were preached so often and so frequently and with such severity and sincerity, they felt it was their duty to establish their own government. They felt it was their duty to make sure the people that they were putting in place were God's choice, which is why George Washington was elected twice with the unanimous vote. They believed they had the power to put bounds and limitations around government as they believed God would have them to do. And so, again, these weren't just whims that our founding fathers just, pulled something out of their backside and put it on paper and it worked great. This was stuff that, this took, hundreds of years of theological study to come to. And it really is a shame that we're seeing, our foundation just being tossed by the wayside because we've got a bunch of people that, think it's mean or hateful, or, they falsely assume that it's, racist or whatever else, or that America was built on the backs of slaves. That's a bunch of crap, to be frank with you. It's garbage. Christianity, as we're going to, continue to show you through the next several weeks, Christianity is the only people in American history that have stood up for black rights, and to free the slaves, and stood up for American Indians and fought to prevent the Trail of Tears. Christians were the ones that did that. It was not liberal Democrats. Okay, the liberal Democrats. This is kind of a rabbit trail here. If you trace back their lineage, it goes back to the South in about 1860. And we all know what happened in the South in 1860. Okay? Christians, true Christians, are the ones that have been fighting for freedom and liberty. True Christians are the ones that proclaim liberty throughout all the land on the Liberty Bell because we believe it. It's not just a whimsical idea that we have had recently. This is something that Christians believe thoroughly, and it's something that, that hopefully will carry on for generations and generations throughout, the next several centuries in the United States. But fourth, just to kind of summarize all these points, the reasons given for these three doctrines is simply this: because the foundation of authority is laid, firstly, in the free consent of the people. And that summarizes everything. And again, I encourage you, go read 1 Samuel chapter 8. Read the whole chapter. It's not long. And then also go read 1 Samuel chapter 12. You will not come away with anything other than, actually there's several principles in 1 Samuel chapter 8, but I won't get into those right now just for the sake of, staying on task here. But, there's a lot you can learn out of the whole Bible. But 1 Samuel chapter 8 and 1 Samuel chapter 12 are some of the best reading you will do on civil government and how God expects it to operate. And really how God, his relationship with nations and how nations respond to him, and how we should, kind of pattern ourselves after. The Israelites in this particular story were very rebellious, and they said, no, we know what's best for ourselves. God does not. We're going to put up our government the way we want to do it because we want to do it like all the other nations around us. And God said, okay, all right, go ahead. You do that. But God was also good enough to give them what would happen if they did that, and gave out the whole, there's probably 10, 15 verses in 1 Samuel chapter 8 that go through exactly what would happen to the nation of Israel if they put a king in place. Lo and behold, that is exactly what happened to them. And to be completely honest with you, the rest of the accounts of Israel through, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and all the stories of David and Solomon, all the issues that they had as a nation, I believe can be traced back to this point where they put a monarchy in place when God wanted a Republican form of government. A Republican form of government would have, David could not have been able to commit his sin with Bathsheba had a Republican form of government been put in place. Solomon couldn't have had 1,000 wives and concubines had a Republican form of government been in place, because there are limits and bounds set with a Republican form of government around authority. David and Solomon didn't have that, and that was directly against what God wanted for Israel. But Israel did what they wanted, and they suffered the consequences for it. So it really is what it is, and now it's stuff for us to learn from, important stuff for us to learn from. But really and truthfully, that is the case. But anyway. Those are the three doctrines that our foundation is rests, and those three doctrines are pervasive throughout our founding documents. And as I mentioned earlier, the violation of these three things are what has produced the issues we have had in the past couple of years. Just recently, we've had the Durham report come out, where it's made very clear that the FBI, on their own sort of volition, and I won't even say the FBI as a whole, but really a couple of people in the FBI that thought they knew better than the American people, decided that they were going to make the election go the way they knew was going to be the best way for the American people and for their agenda. And so they overstepped all three of those doctrines. They put themselves in place of the people as far as how government should be, structured. They made themselves the government in this case. Number two, they violated the vote. They literally stole the vote. And I'm not saying, don't hear what I'm not saying here as far as the election. I don't, it's possible that it changed the results of the election and flipped the election. Very possible. It's very difficult to prove that. So let me just go ahead and get that out of the way. However, I do believe that there was some element of fraud throughout the whole process with, states changing laws 6 months before the election, everything else. That's a side note. But the FBI, were actively taking votes and causing people who weren't doing their homework and not doing their due diligence, causing their minds to be changed over stuff that the FBI has admitted was a load of crap. They literally made it up, and they will tell you they made it up. And so, that's two doctrines right there that are violated. The third of which being the bounds, and people have the right to set the bounds and limitations. The FBI, if there were bounds and limitations, overstepped them and threw them to the side and did what they thought was quote unquote right for the country without you even knowing it was going on. And so there is a great example just very recently where those three doctrines that were set forth in the Mayflower Compact back in 1620, had they been followed and understood by our government and had been followed by our government, we would not have had the problems we have had, I'll say the past 100 years, but more recently, the past 4 years. And so you can thank your rusty, trusty government for that. So anyway, not to get on a rant there, a rabbit trail, but point being is, all these people that are, the Peter Strzok's of the world, the Adam Schiffs of the world that believe that they know better than you. Let me just tell you, and this is just friend to friend here, they don't know their butt from a hole in the ground whenever it comes to the way God ordained government should work. They are idiots. To be completely blunt with you, they would not know good government if it bit them in the backside. And so you have a responsibility to make sure that you do. You have a responsibility to make sure that the people that are put in place in your government know what government, God-ordained government, should look like and follow it to the letter. And if they don't, it's your responsibility to go to doctrine number 2 and kick their sorry carcass out of Congress or out of the White House or out of your local county commission. Kick their sorry carcass out and put somebody in that will do God's will. You have it might sound a little corny, and the reason it sounds corny is because we don't believe it can be done anymore. And, I'm sorry, but it absolutely can, and it must be done, or, we're going to live in tyranny. And so, really and truthfully, friend to friend here, Gordon to you, whoever is listening to this radio, or to this broadcast, we will live in tyranny if you choose to. If you choose not to, then we won't. But the decision solely lies with you. If you want to live in tyranny, I don't. And I believe you wouldn't if you knew what tyranny really was. Tyranny offers security for the low, low price of your freedom. And it is not worth it. And the reason it's not worth it is it's a lie. It's a lie. It's no different than a teenage boy telling a girl, hey, I'm going to stick around forever. I'm going to marry you. We're going to have 18 kids. She gives a precious thing to him, and then he takes off down the road never to be seen again. That is exactly what the Democratic Party and the progressive left in this country are trying to convince you to do, is give away your purity as a Christian, God-ordained, and Christian-founded government. Your purity is they're trying to get you to sell your purity down the road, and they're going to turn around and take off running. And they're going to be eating empanadas on the side of the road like stinking Maduro down there in Venezuela. Now, if you want that, that's fine. If you want to be sitting on the side of your bed crying your makeup down your face, that's fine. You can do that. I'm not going to do that. And so I encourage you, I beg you, as your friend, as your fellow American, in the spirit of 1776 this year and this summer, I beg you, look tyranny in the face and say, no more. We have had it. It is time that government recognizes its place, which is below the people. Public servants are just that. They are servants. And don't let them try to sell you something that you know is going to wreck your life and leave you broken and miserable and starving, by the way. Guys, I know I'm kind of ranting here a little bit, but America has offered something, let me rephrase that. American Christians have offered you something so unique that the world has never seen it before. And that is peace and liberty in our time. And it is solely your decision whether we keep that liberty and that freedom, or if we live in tyranny, and if your children live in tyranny, and if your children's children live in tyranny. As Ronald Reagan once said, liberty is only one generation away from being stolen. I will be darned if my generation, if I don't do everything I can to make sure that liberty stays for my child and my children's children. Until next week, America, I love you. You are an incredibly fascinating place, and I never get tired of learning about you, America. You are a special place, and you deserve praise, and you deserve to be oogled over and marveled over. You deserve for people to honor you and to lift you up and recognize you for your pure foundation and your God-ordained civil government. Whether or not the eggheads that are currently in power recognize that or not is a different story. America, I love you. Until next week, God bless America. Please don't forget to go check out speedwellcoffee.com, straight off of Plymouth, Massachusetts, the Ethiopia Bombay Abore. By the way, just so you know just how great this coffee is, on their website, it has 5 out of 5 stars on the reviews. Now, there's only one review. It was not me, but it will soon be 5 out of 5 stars and 2 reviews as soon as I get through recording this podcast, because I'm going to go leave a 5-star review. Until next week, America, I love you. God bless. See you next week. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.
It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. It